I'm going to mute everybody. There's probably going to be a thing that says. Right, good evening, everybody. Welcome to part 4 of the 2023 BGA FRTOL course. This evening, I will be talking, Andrew will be doing breakouts, and Chula will be taking questions. So any questions that you have, please send them via the chat to Chula. My normal reminder for coaches, please make sure you've got a star in front of your name. Otherwise, Andrew won't know to put you in a group as a coach. Righty-ho. Well, let me start by seeing if I can do my screen share in a slightly different way from normal, so this might be entertaining. Okay. Do we have a screen full of, not that one, a screen full of a title slide? Andrew, can you?
Yes, we do.
We do. Excellent. Thank you very much. Right. Here we go then. So I thought we'd start. There's a bunch of things. Some of them came up last year, so I've left them in. There's a couple that have come up in a lot of questions this year. So I thought we'd just cover those. The first is to talk about, well, Matt's call signs particularly. And it's worth saying that Matt's call signs can vary. So unless you pay attention, you're not necessarily going to know who to call. So it can be Lakenheath Radar, Marham Director, Benson Zone, Odium Approach. You'll find the frequency on the map and on the frequency reference card and in the frequency file that you might have for your radio. But if you don't know the suffix, then just start with the place. So if you call Lakenheath and see what they say back to you, that's the way that you can find out. It's also worth noting that the frequency reference card isn't always accurate about these things. So for example, there is a separate frequency, or at least there was a little while ago when I last looked, for Cambridge radar, but actually Cambridge radar come up on the approach frequency, not on the published radar frequency. So until you talk to them, you won't know. Cranfield approach and tower are usually both on the approach frequency. And if you get a BRIZE, you'll need BRIZE zone if you're going to do a zone crossing, and BRIZE radar if you want a lower airspace radar service. I think we've mentioned that gliding clubs ought not use radio as their suffix. They ought to be base or launch point. But if you're going to do the exam, it's pretty straightforward. Just use the frequencies you're given and you'll be fine. I wanted to say something about position reports. And this is a little tricky. The RT exam requires that you know how to do what we call a procedural position report. And a procedural position report is this one. Glider Oscar November, SOAM 15, 3,000 feet, Cambridge 30. So that's who we are, Glider Oscar November. We were at SOAM at time 15 minutes past the hour, at 3,000 feet on the QNH, and we will be at Cambridge at time 30. So you need to know how to do that. It's not very useful in real life in a glider. I don't think I've ever done it in a glider, and I very, very rarely do it, even in a powered airplane. In a glider, the controller probably isn't going to know our next turn point, especially if it's a BGA turning point. And there's no chance we're going to have a good estimate for when we're there. It depends on how well we get on and whether we get any decent climbs, and we can easily be stuck for 15 minutes. But you need it for the test. So in the test, you're going to have well-defined turning points and distances. So if you're asked to report SOAM, for example, give a procedural position report when you get there virtually, and make a rough estimate for the next time. And you can just assume that you're going to do 60 kilometers per hour cross country. So that's 2 minutes per nautical mile. In real life, if you're asked to report SOAM, give the controller some situational awareness. So glider Oscar November, SOAM at 15, altitude 3000, tracking northwest would be fine. Or next turn point, Melton Mowbray. The Americans won't understand that because they won't know where Melton Mowbray is, so northwest is better for them. This is something that a few of us have had a lengthy chat about over the past week, and it comes from a discussion in one or two of the groups last week. And the question is, what do these phrases mean? Report a beam and report north of beam. Now, a beam is well defined. It's a nautical term, and it means if you're flying along, when the thing you're talking about is your wings pointing down towards it. So if you look along the wing, you can see that place. It's at right angles to your track. But north of beam actually turns out not to be well defined. And even worse than that, it turns out that there are two possible meanings for it. And they're quite confident they've got the right one, but they don't agree. So one possible meaning is that we are to the north of any town. If we're asked to report north of beam of any town, and it's on the wingtip. Or the other possible meaning is it's report when you're directly north of any town. And it turns out that most people think it's A, but a sizable minority think it's B. We can find a reference in CAT 413 and it suggests A rather than B. But given the uncertainty, I don't think I'd volunteer to use that. But if somebody uses it on you, it's probably this one it means. I think we need to get a better definition of that somewhere, but it's really hard to find one at the moment. We've got a couple of errors that have crept into the scripts, which we'll fix for the next time that we do this course. But one of them, which I wanted to raise with you, is what happens if air traffic tell you about traffic information. And you have two choices. You can either say traffic in sight or traffic not sighted. And I think we say, somewhere we say traffic, I can't remember what we say, but it's not quite right. That's it.
It says traffic sighted in the...
Traffic sighted, thank you, that's what we said, and it's wrong. So try and remember traffic in sight and traffic not sighted. Okay, so that was the quick scamper over things that we need to remind you about. Little reminder, though, as to why we're talking to airfields. And here's Cambridge, and here's Gloucester, and these blue lines are the instrument approaches of these various airfields, more or less. I don't think they actually got this little bit here or that little bit there done. But there's a lot of them. So if you're going to fly east-west across the country, you don't really have much choice but to go through these instrument approaches. So it is sort of worthwhile talking to the relevant ATSU when you do so. A little reminder about full calls. There's a point in CAT 413 where it says that you're required to state your flight rules in initial calls for arriving and departing flights and for crossings of Class C, D, and E airspace. You can do it in Class G as well, but you don't have to. So that means that, for example, glider Charlie Delta from Granston Lodge to Granston Lodge, overhead Enston, altitude 3,000 feet, QNH 1021, VFR, routing wantage. And that tells the people that we're talking to that we are flying by visual flight rules. And if we were going through Class D, that's going to make a big difference to what they need to do with us. So, why are we doing a TNG flight? Well, primarily, I mean, apart from the fact it could be useful for those of you who are going to go on and do TNG flying, this course gets you a full FRTOL. So just the same as if you were flying a Cessna 150 or something, you're going to have a full FRTOL. You go on to fly an Airbus with this thing. So you need to know a bit more than just how to use the radio for a glider in order to pass the test. Also, there's a benefit in that learning that helps you understand how other people operate. If as I know some of you have, you want to extend your license to a TMG, which is a fairly easy thing to do. You can do so. And actually, what we're teaching you here is the same as we've been doing for gliders, but there's just a few additions that we need to put in. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the differences between VFR power and gliding. If you're a powered aircraft, you more often, I think, fly to and from airfields with full air traffic control, or maybe in controlled airspace. Whereas in gliding, we don't typically. We tend to stay away from those places, and we'll fly from one gliding field back to that gliding field. Maybe getting a basic service from some people on the way, but that can be the limit of what we do. So that means that we need to do a full radio check at those airfields, which we wouldn't at the gliding field. Cambridge Tower, Golf Bravo, Kilo Mike Alpha, radio check 125.905. Where at best we might go Granston launch point, radio check, glider 28 radio check. So we have to taxi and take off, and at an air traffic control airfield, we need an actual clearance to do that, and we'll come to that. Power pilots tend to write things down on an e-pad, and it's much less common for a glider pilot. I don't use an e-pad in a glider, mostly because I don't really have room, and it gets in the way. When I do it, sometimes when I'm instructing, I have an e-pad, then it tends to go down the side of my leg rather than on my leg for most of the time. Powered airplanes tend to fly level and in straight lines. I don't know about you, but I can't do that in a glider. Powered airplanes often try and get a service from an ATSU for the whole trip. So change from one air traffic control unit to another. And again, we don't do that in glider. We'll switch to a gliding frequency. We'll turn the radio off. We just talk to people when we have to. So here's quite a big difference. Powered aircraft can only fly in IMC if the pilot has an instrument qualification. And we don't have that restriction. We can fly in technical IMC, so that's near cloud, above 3,000 feet, without any sort of instrument qualification. And the cloud flying rating is well, actually, you don't even need that to fly in cloud, although you might be foolish to do that without suitable practice and abilities. Powered aircraft have more regular joining and circuit procedures, and we'll come to those in a bit. And then we're going to need to taxi after we've landed. So there's quite a lot of difference between what we might do as a powered airplane, and we're going to use the TMG in that way in a moment, and a glider. It is possible to fly power VFR just like a glider, class G strip, without an ATSU to another one and talk to nobody. You don't actually need a radio, but we could be going from a class D to class D, maybe in controlled airspace all the way. So the language is the same. What we're asking for tends to be a little bit different. It's worthwhile, if you're doing that, developing a bit of a shorthand to write things down, particularly if people are giving you clearances, which you've got to write down. So I do things like this. I have up arrows and down arrows for climb and descend, for turns, an R with a report in it. ROCAS means remain outside controlled airspace, which is a common thing to hear. And an FO30 is flight level 30. So I've got a little shorthand. It stops me. Excuse me, I'm going to cough for a moment. It stops me having to write too much. And given how bad my handwriting is, that's a good thing. Okay. There's this thing called LARS, Lower Airspace Radar Service. And it's pretty useful if you're a GA traffic, and if you've got a transponder particularly. It's provided by a mix of civil and military airfields. It can give you a basic service and a traffic service, which is the useful bit from them, possibly a deconfliction service, but they struggle with that one in any reasonable weather. That is when the weather is nice and lots of other people are around. You need to remember these numbers. It's available within 30 nautical miles and below flight level 100. And it's available both IFR and VFR. And it's by no means full coverage of the country, and certainly not at weekends. Whether they can do it or not depends on how busy they are. You're less likely to get a traffic service when it's busy, which is exactly the wrong way around. and the military providers are often closed at weekends. As glider pilots, we don't usually use that service, but GA pilots do, and you need to know about it for the test. Here's a possibly out of date by now map of LARS providers, and you can see the different people who provide it, and quite a few of those are military. So Marham, Boscombe Down, Bryce Norton, Yeovilton, they're all military providers. So if they go home, there's rather less of this map than there would otherwise be. It's a bit unfortunate living in Cambridge and wanting to go west because you're in this big gap, but that's life. So if we're going to fly from a Class D airfield to a Class D airfield, which is the most complex example, we're going to find that airfields are going to have several frequencies. Got a ground frequency, possibly. They're going to control air traffic on the ground. We've got a tower frequency who controls traffic on the runway and in the ATZ if there is one. And we've got one or more approach radar and zone frequencies. So lots of people to talk to. On the way out, we're going to need to get a radio check. We're going to need to get the ATIS. That's the Aerodrome Terminal Information Service, I think. So it's the weather and the airfield information, which is broadcast as a repeating transmission. We're going to need to get a taxi clearance, perhaps with the ground frequency. We're going to need a departure clearance, if Class D. So that's what happens after we take off, not a takeoff clearance. And it uses the word departure, not takeoff, to avoid accidents, because when people used to say takeoff, there were accidents. And they'll say approved, not cleared. We'll need to get a takeoff clearance, and after that, after we get airborne, we'll change to approach, radar, or zone. And on leaving the zone, we'll change to the next en route frequency. So there's quite a lot to do in comparison with just lobbing ourselves airborne from a gliding site and disappearing. But it's very procedural, and at most stages, you're told what to do. So it becomes relatively easy. Okay, so let's have a look at a few of those things. A taxi clearance. So a taxi clearance is an example of a route clearance, and a route clearance contains a clearance limit and a route. So the clearance limit is how far this clearance gets you, and the route is how you get there. So it might be something like taxi holding point November via Tango November. So the clearance limit is holding point November, which, if we look on this map, is I think about here. And we're going to taxi via taxiway Tango November. Well, here's November. Here's taxiway November. The after departure clearance, that's the clearance to fly in the Class D around the airfield. And again, it's got a clearance limit and a route. So for example, after departure, clear to the zone boundary via Stony Cross, not above altitude 2,000 feet, right turnout. So the clearance limit is the zone boundary. The route is via Stony Cross with a right turn. And there's something else in there, which is a limitation, not above altitude 2,000 feet. So we can get airborne, turn right after we've climbed far enough, head towards this place called Stony Cross, and keep going to the zone boundary. That's what we're allowed to do. And then we get a takeoff clearance, and there's an absolutely mandated form of words for that. We're going to say something like Golf Charlie Delta ready for departure, not ready for takeoff, ready for departure. They're going to say Golf Charlie Delta runway 26 cleared for takeoff, perhaps with a surface wind as well. So surface wind 250, 10 knots. And then we repeat back the mandatory parts of those, which are the runway 26 cleared for takeoff, Golf Charlie Delta. You don't repeat back the surface wind, just anything to do with the runway, anything to do with the clearance and our call sign. If we're arriving in Class D, we're going to need to get the ATIS rather than have somebody read it to us. So we'll need to tune into that frequency and listen to what it says, write it down on our knee pad. We're then going to call approach or radar or zone, whoever it is. And then we're going to need to get a VFR clearance into the zone. And at a Class D airfield, that might well be based on what are called visual reporting points and published visual approach procedures, possibly lanes that the VMC traffic VFR traffic will go into. Before we get to the ATZ, they'll change us to tower. They'll tell us to change to tower. Tower will give us joining instructions, for example, join downwind or right base or overhead. Then we'll need a landing clearance. So the words cleared to land are going to have to appear in there somewhere. And on the ground, we might be asked to call runway vacated. And then once we've vacated, we might change to ground and get a taxi clearance. So in some ways, this is easier, as in you don't need to make any decisions than taking a glider to a less controlled airfield. But it does require good RT, and you need to know about the local VRPs and procedures. So you need to do your homework before you get there. It's really important in general and for the test that you understand the requirements for different airfields and ATSUs. So here's quite a useful diagram. So we've got the different sorts of ATSUs along the top. So air traffic control, the airfield flight information service and the air ground communication service, and then the case when there's nobody. And then we've got people with controlled airspace, and so something like Bryce, Bryce is a good example, or Norwich maybe. Or we've got people in Class G, somewhere like Cambridge. So if it's Class D, we absolutely have to get a clearance for the whole thing. If it's Class G, then it's best to talk to approach on the way in, but we need an approval to go into the ATZ. And then if in an AFIS, a flight information service, still want to talk to them before we get there, we need to be in communication with them to go into the ATZ, but they can't give us approval. On the ground, so we need it. On the ground, we will need approval. So to land and to taxi, we need their approval. And then for the air ground, we need to be talking to them for all those things, but they can't tell us what to do. I don't say that in a no way. I'm making the point that they won't tell you what to do. So don't expect them to tell you what to do. You're likely to get the words Roger out of from them, whatever you say. So you need to decide what to do. You're the decision maker at this point. And if there's nobody around, it's still best to talk, but there's this thing called safety comm, where you can call and other people might be listening on the same frequency. But because it's a shared frequency, you need to be quite specific about which station you're talking to. Right, let's talk a little bit about circuits. So this is a powered aeroplane coming into a circuit, and there's something called a standard overhead join. And a standard overhead join, so if it's a left-hand circuit, and by default it is a left-hand circuit, but very often it's not, so you need to be aware, either by talking to them or by looking on the chart. You would fly into the airfield and try and fly over the landing threshold. And if it's a left-hand circuit, you put the airfield on your left. So as you go over the landing threshold, you can then descend. So you do this at 2,000 feet above airfield. You descend to circuit height in a big curve, and that's called dead side. Then you're crosswind, then you're downwind. They don't do diagonals, so we've got a base leg and then final. So those are the different points. And you'd make radio calls, dead side descending, probably downwind, and probably final, unless they ask you to do something different. So those three, dead side descending, downwind, and final are the typical calls. You might say runway vacated when you're off the runway. There is a call called long final, which is defined as 4 to 8 miles away. So that's really quite a long way. If we're a glider, though, and we want to go into such an airfield, well, we're probably not going to do that. We could, I guess, but if we're at 2,000 feet, it would be unusual. Now, mostly we're going to land at airfields like that because we've run out of height, so we're going to be a lot lower than 2,000 feet. So we could conceivably join overhead and use the air brakes dead side, but unlikely. So we're likely to be short of height, and we're going to need some other sort of join. So tell them what's happening. If you're coming in, let them know what you're doing. You might be joining left base for a runway, for example. You're going to be probably doing so relatively low. If you're looking to thermal in their ATZ, you're going to need to negotiate with them, and it gets a bit more complicated, but you can use the English language. It doesn't have to have a Cat 413 phrase in there. So request an enter ATZ to thermal is a good one. They might say that's fine. You can tell them you may need to land if I can't find a climb. I've on a number of occasions thermaled right over the active threshold or on the runway at various places, and they've been really helpful about it. And basically I tell them, look, I'm going to do this. If I'm in your way, I'll land, but if not, I think I might be able to get a climb. And they've always been great about it. And the key is talking to them. So the suggestions are keep a good lookout and listen for other traffic. Be prepared to land if you're getting in the way. Be very clear about where you are, what you're going to do, why. Tell them if you're climbing, because that's useful information. Tell them when you're clear of the ATZ. Treat airfields with an ATSU but no ATZ more or less as if they do have an ATZ. The reason they won't have an ATZ is the CAA decided to insist that to get an ATZ you needed to be licensed. To be licensed you needed to pay a fee, and airfields are typically short of money, so lots of them stopped being licensed, stopped paying the fee, and lost their ATZs. I think the CAA will do something about that one day. They've put it in their long-term plan, but that's a way off. But you can have fairly busy airfields who don't have an ATZ, and if you're going to go fly through their circuit, you will talk to them. And then I've mentioned safety comm for airfields without an ATSU or a discrete frequency. If they won't accept you into the ATZ, you'll probably be told to remain clear of the ATZ. Only people who can do that actually are people with full air traffic control. It's not very likely. It's a standard response from Lakenheath and Mildenhall, but most other places are okay. The really busy military bases probably won't like it. I think if you try to go do it at Oxford, they might be a little worried, but most places aren't that busy, and they're pretty happy. Okay.
We talked about the letter of agreement with Cambridge being a life.
Oh, sorry, that's my.
What is an RMZ?
Hang on. So currently, let's have a look at RMZs. Can somebody just wave if you're hearing me talking twice? Okay. How do I stop that? Oh, I think probably we just got to leave it. Okay. Currently, there are only 2 RMZs in the country, and I think at the moment they're Harden and Scilly Isles, but there might be more on the way. At Harden, to fly in the RMZ, you must comply with one of the following. You either need 2-way RT comms, you need the Harden listening squawk and monitor their frequency, excuse me, and if you're non-radio, telephone and agree before the flight, or operate according to a letter of agreement. The rules say you should establish communications 15 nautical miles or 5 minutes, whichever is greater. That wasn't written for gliders. You need to understand that's the rule, but I talked to them with the 5 minutes rather than the 15 nautical miles, same as for MATSs. You should include the flight rules. If they tell you to stand by, you don't have 2-way comms. And for TMZs, there's transponder mandatory zones. A radio call can usually replace the transponder, but access won't be guaranteed. Right, so that was most of what we want to talk about. If you haven't found it yet, script rehearsal could be very useful for you when you're practicing. And it works on your phone or probably on your tablet. And Robin produce some instructions as to how to get it working on a laptop or something. So recommend that to you to practice, and we've got some scripts which will talk to each of these things. So the group work tonight is the TMG flight to Cambridge. I've noticed that the script isn't as rigorous as it should be with the use of call signs. Doesn't really matter, in that all you need to do is, providing you say the right thing on the way in, you just repeat whatever they say back. So you use their call sign on the first call. They will tell you who they are when they reply first time, and you can shorten your call sign after they've shortened it. They'll use yours twice before they do that. So I think we've set it as an exercise. Improve our scripts for us. Thank you very much. Next week, we're going to be talking about emergencies and VHF direction finding. For those of you who want to do the test, I'd start on this one now. You need to know, really off by heart, the format of the emergency call. It's a pain. To be honest, if you sit me down, I wouldn't be able to do it, because very rarely would you actually go through all these things if you had a real emergency. But this is what the CAA want you to be able to do. So here it is. It's Mayday, 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 or Pam, 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 Pam. Who you're calling, your call sign and type, the nature of emergency and intentions, your position, level, heading, the pilot qualifications, and any other details. You will have that on a crib sheet for the test, which is really useful now. But you need to know your way around it, be able to put together that message. So, time for questions, I think.
Great, thank you. Do you want to stop sharing, probably? Thanks. TMG means touring motor glider, like, for instance, a Grob 109. 30 miles of what? I think I was probably right in Paul, but you probably said you need to call a large unit within 30 miles. So 30 miles of the station you're calling. So if it's RAF Wittering, if you're calling Wittering zone, then within 30 miles of that. Carol's pointed out that, and you may have just touched on this, Paul, that the full message doesn't include the motor glider type, or doesn't include the words motor glider in the Cambridge script. Should it? Yes, it should. So when
so I think you've got two choices there, actually.
Go ahead.
So in theory, the full call has your call sign and type. So if I'm in the Mooney, it's Golf Bravo Kilo Mike Alpha Mooney 201 from A to B. Mm-hmm. If I'm in a glider, I just say glider whatever, mm-hmm. and that takes care of the type. Now the motor glider is a bit in between, so you could say the type SF25, or you could say motor glider, or you could use motor glider as a prefix like we do for glider. I think you've got a few choices there, but
okay. There was a question why a route clearance, and there was some confusion. I think I've probably cleared it up with a direct message, but just to say that if you're in a piece of controlled airspace, and that might be an ATZ, you're getting a clearance to the zone boundary, and then you're probably in Class G after that. So imagine you're in a piece, for instance, and at Cranfield occasionally do this. You're in an ATZ, a zone traffic zone. So they might say you're cleared to the zone boundary on the runway heading, not above altitude 1,500 feet. So they're telling you how they want you to leave. In this case, fly straight ahead to the zone boundary. Yes, after that, you're in Class G. Someone's pointed out the slides are different. We always keep modifying them. So as usual, I'm sure Paul will upload this current version to the website.
I will indeed.
Yep, thank you. Phil King says, if landing out of hours, e.g. for an air ground or an AFIS station, then address your calls, airfield name and traffic, e.g. Skegness traffic. Yes. Paul, I think I know what you mean, but you might want to just say something about this. You said, if asked to stand by, you don't have two-way comms. So what's the right answer if a controller, quote, says stand by?
Okay, so the right answer if a controller says stand by is to say nothing.
Great.
What I'm getting at here, though, is that in order to enter an ATZ, if it has full air traffic control, you need permission or approval. For the other two types, AFIS and air ground, you need two-way comms. You need enough information to do the flight safely, I think is what the rule actually says. But that implies that you've had some sort of conversation with them. You've told them you're there and they've told you information about the airfield and any traffic. What the CAA say, though, is that it is not good enough to have called them and got the response stand by. That does not allow you to enter the ATZ under those circumstances. That's what I meant by that.
And this is Andrew, just for completeness, as far as I know, the same thing also applies to an RMZ.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Correct. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Was asked where to find SafetyCom. I keep wondering where to find that, so I Googled it. But anyway, the answer is 135.480, and I put it into my contacts because I keep forgetting it under SafetyCom. 135.
I think it would be, if I didn't, a couple of answers to that. If I didn't have the system, I'd put it in the radio as a stored frequency under SafetyCom. There's lots of radios that you can do that with. If you get the, if you take the airfield and landouts data that I provide, actually I have SafetyCom as the default for everywhere that doesn't have its own frequency. So you can just look up the airfield and it will say 135.480.
Thanks. What is an RMZ? A radio mandatory zone. So Paul's given you the full answer to that, but the short answer is you can't go in there without talking on the radio. That's the short answer. Full answer has just been briefed. And if you turn your engine off in the TMG, does your prefix become glider? With that, Paul, I'll give you that question and
how lucky are you feeling, I think, is the answer to that one. I probably still call myself no, I'd still say motor glider. Yeah. Maybe engine off motor glider or something. The Grob 109 is not going to perform like my Shark, is it, under those circumstances?
Yeah.
And gents, a couple of questions found their way to me as well, which I'll take if you've both done.
Yep.
So Nicholas Taylor says, do we need to request a basic service if we want to thermal in an ATZ, or just request to enter to thermal? And Nicholas, the basic service is always optional, but if you want to enter an ATZ for any reason, you must establish communication with the controlling agency, and if it's an ATCO, you must get permission. So whether you're entering it to thermal or entering it for any other reason, the rules are the same as far as entering ATZs go.
Can I just add something to that?
Yeah, sure.
Which is that it's a really good strategy to have called them a few miles before and 10 minutes before. If you're getting too close to somebody where you think there's a vague possibility you want to get into their ATZ, start by getting a basic service with them. You're then on their radar, as it were, whether they've got one or not. When you want the zone entry, it's a much easier conversation than if you just call them up 30 seconds before you hit the boundary and say, please, can I enter?
Yeah, nobody likes surprises. And one more from Mark Saunders, following on from the idea that you must establish two-way communication before entering an ATZ or an RMZ. Mark points out, so effectively, if they told you to stand by and never got back to you, they could effectively deny you entry. And does that ever happen? It's a theoretical possibility, Mark. I've never heard of it happening, but you're right. It's a theoretical possibility.
Yeah, I think it's the subject of much conversation amongst the powered flying community for just that reason, but I'm not sure it really happens, and it's the sort of thing that you could complain about if it did.
Absolutely. I think if it ever did happen, this would be a suitable opportunity to fill in the form we mentioned last week. Okay. Martin is also asking a question. Martin Hayward asked a question about an airfield information. What does information Yankee represent? That means that you've previously tuned to the AFIS, the automatic, the tape loop that basically gives you weather and runway information. And each time they update the information on that tape loop, they give it a new letter. So information Yankee means you have listened to the AFIS that was announcing it was giving you information Yankee. So that if it changed in the 20 seconds after you changed channel to information Zulu, the controller would know that you had the previous information, not the current information.
Yeah,
Andrew, I think you're saying AFIS.
what they'll often say is you'll say I've got information Yankee, and they'll say information Zulu now current, no significant change.
Indeed.
Or something like that. Or if there's a significant change, they'll tell you what it is.
That's what it is.
Yeah.
I also have a question myself. Guy Westgate is on the call. Guy, are you coaching this year? And
I am, but tonight I have very poor internet, so I won't be able to coach later on.
okay. Well, I've put you in somebody else's group, Guy. Do you want to have your own coaching group or not?
No, I've got to end the call very soon. I've got
Okay.
to say very poor internet tonight.
Okay. Well, you'll be in James Smart's group, but you're a supernumerary, so you can drop out. Okay, that was it. I've
I've got one more that's been sent to me.
Sure.
What comms if overflying an ATZ? And the answer to that, I think, is again useful to set up the communications with the ATSU early, in case you descend into it, or in case there's traffic trying to do stuff above it. So don't sort of sneak over the top of it thinking, well, I'm above 2,000 feet above it, so it's okay. Talk to them. So much better to sort stuff out early rather than late. Oh, another one, do you have to report changing frequency from ground to tower when on the runway? They will ask you to change frequency. They will tell you to change frequency. You don't do it autonomously. That's it from me, Andrew, I think.
Okay, just talk quietly amongst yourselves for 1 more minute or 30 more seconds whilst I just shuffle Guy around, and then, and in fact, I think he's just dropped out. Yep, he's just dropped out. Okay.
So I've got one more question while you do that. Do you have to sign off when you've finished your flight? Not typically, no. If you're at an airfield with air traffic control, for example, they will give you a taxi clearance to wherever you're going to go park. You just park and shut down. You don't need to talk to me.
Okay, well, I'm not to hurry anybody, but when you're all done with questions, the breakouts are ready.
Excellent. Sheila, we got anything more, or we good to go?
No, good to go.
All right, Andrew, over to you.
Okay, so I'm going to hit the button. Don't forget, when you join the breakout group, please note down the number so that if you need to go back up the top level to get Paul to bail you out of some problem, you'll know which group you came from. So please note the number of your breakout group. And I should be joining breakout group 29 if all goes well. Let's see if it does. Okay, thanks everybody. Good luck this evening. See you next week.